the last thing I want to do, and then we'll go to just a couple of phone calls, and then we'll get out of here, though, is this interview from Melinda Gates, because I found this sort of stunning. So Melinda Gates was interviewed in the New York Times on tech innovation, global health, and her own privilege. And
maybe start with that one.
She, she says, to her credit, nobody's had to argue with her like you're privileged in this. To her credit, we have to think about our privilege. I have to think about my privilege every day. She says, to her credit, good for her. That's good. And they were asked, what's a recent epiphany you've had about your privilege? She wrote that it's not, or she answered, it's not enough to read about it. You have to be in the community with people who don't look like you. When I read about a shooting, maybe in the south side of Seattle, I'm not living the experience, where if I have a friend who's a person of color, they most likely are living that experience or know somebody who is part of that community. And so my youngest daughter and I, we have a lot of friends who I'm meeting, and they're of very mixed races. I love that. We have this motto we go by: every single person who walks through our door should feel comfortable in our house, despite how large it is, and that it has nice art.
Wow.
So here's a person who I think, look, she's obviously well-intentioned. And there's no doubt in my mind that Bill and Melinda Gates, for the most part, are well-intentioned. Or let me put it this way. It's one of those things I can't possibly know, so let's assume it. Which is all the more reason why we should have laws to protect our society from people like this, because they really do feel like they're well-intentioned, and maybe they are well-intentioned. But the problem is that the amount of money that they have can have such detrimental effects on society when they attempt to be well-intentioned that it is unfair to the rest of us. It is undemocratic to allow two individuals who are so well-intentioned but so clueless about certain things, like anybody would be clueless about things, to have that type of impact. I could be completely clueless. But all that I'm saying into this microphone, all the cluelessness that I'm putting onto the microphone, is not going to have really any type of major impact on society. But when a billionaire is clueless, they can have an enormous impact on society. So they ask her to get back to philanthropy. What about the notion that the foundation's work on an issue like public education is inherently anti-democratic? You've spent money in that area in a way that maybe seems like it's crowding out people's actual wants in that area. What's your counter to that criticism? What this is in reference to is over $700 million, could be up to $1 billion, that they dumped into the educational field, invested in just a few districts in the country to test out their theories of education. Can we run this like a business? Can we assess what an educator is doing in the classroom if we use metrics in the same way we would do, like, how many widgets are we turning out? And they did this over the course of like 5 or 6, 7 years, I think it was, an experiment. And she writes, she responds, Bill and I always go back to, what is philanthropy's role? It is to be catalytic. Remember that. Remember that. It's to try and put new ideas forward and test them and see if they work. If you can convince government to scale up, that is how you have success. But philanthropic dollars are a tiny slice of the United States education budget. Even if we put in $1 billion into the state of California, that's not going to do much. So we experiment with things. If we had been successful, David, you'd see a lot more charter schools. I'd love to see 20% charter schools in every state, but we haven't been successful.
Dear God.
We haven't been successful. I'd love to say we had outsized influence. We don't. Now, here's the thing. She is so clueless. She's right about the fact that what she does is to be catalytic. Because if a billionaire sinks $1 billion into an industry, what else is going to happen? Right, her $1 billion don't measure up against what society spends on education. But all the money that's floating around out there that is looking for a future, all those schools that are desperate for dollars to get some type of program, what are they going to do? She understands they're a catalyst, but what does a catalyst do? It creates change in the marketplace, even if it's not a direct function of what they do. So if I tell you that Warren Buffett is going into, he's cornering the market on flip-flops, guess what everybody's going to do? Everybody's going to go and buy into the flip-flop industry. That's what happened with this. The so-called race to the top, no child left behind, value added on teaching, high stakes testing, all a function of this experiment that the Gates Foundation ran, and they found out a year and a half ago that it was a complete and total failure. That's not my assessment. That is the Rand Corporation, which the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation hired to assess their experiment, and it failed. That's why she says, we haven't been successful. Because they failed. Now, you didn't hear about that. Maybe if you listened to the 1 or 2 episodes we talked about on the show, you heard about it. But you didn't hear about it if you watched the news. And you barely know about it if you read the newspapers. But they failed. Catastrophic failure to the point where the Rand Corporation and their internal audit basically said, it's probably right that we should just do what the educators have been saying.
God
but
forbid.
Yet, those ripples that they created are still reverberating. People are still fighting against this, what they assume to be the case, that high stakes testing is the best way to get results because of the $1 billion they dropped in there. And the problem with that is not that they're bad people or that they're clueless. The problem is they had $1 billion that they got a tax benefit from to try out this experiment. And that's highly problematic that we incentivize and allow for just 2 individuals who have some kooky ideas or not so kooky ideas to change things in the public sphere, something that is supposed to be so democratic as public education. And this reporter pushes back. Certainly you have more influence than, say, a group of parents. Not necessarily. She says, I went and met with a group of 36 parents in Memphis. We thought they had a good idea for them. They were having none of it. So we didn't move forward. A group of parents, a group of teachers, they can have a very large influence. In other words, I don't understand what the word influence means. We might not go and dump a ton of cash in a district where there's a lot of pushback by parents, but we're going to dump it somewhere. And when we dump all that cash, anybody who's involved in any type of investing or philanthropic work, it's not hard to find a school in every district. Well, I don't know how many schools people have in their districts where it's like, oh, we're pursuing a tech curriculum because that's the way we're going to get a big funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I mean, there's multiple of them. So we tore around looking at middle schools and high schools, in the district my daughter goes to school in Brooklyn. There's a couple of schools hurting for cash who are completely reconfiguring their curriculum so that they can look appealing to these type of foundations. And not these type, this foundation. So it's just absurd to say $1 billion dropped into education in a concentrated way by one entity doesn't have influence. I mean, come on. If she believes this, then she's totally clueless. If she doesn't, then she's being a liar. But either way, there's only one way to deal with this. And that is to say, we're going to take that money off of your hands, or we're not going to allow you to make it. We're going to distribute that money before it ends up in your bank account. And we're going to put it into the education system where we actually have decades, if not centuries, of experience in dealing with public education. And what we lack is funding to make it, to distribute across the country and across the socioeconomic areas to deal with it and create a quality education for everyone. And then actually what we're going to do is we're going to take some of that money and we're not even going to put it in the schools. We're going to put it into the communities because educators will tell you, Bill and Melinda, that inputs are the most important determinant as to what the outputs will be at the end of the process. And they came to understand that. If you go read their RAND report, that's what they ultimately learned. But meanwhile, there was a 7-10 year period where the country just went off the rails in terms of education. And there are a lot of people who still think that these theories that have now been debunked by the very people who are pushing them are still operative. And the problem at the end of the day is not that they're bad people. It's just that they had too much money. And it created an imbalance.
Let's help them out.
Yeah, and they were, incentivized by these kinds of narratives to believe that they're special and they're smart and they know better than everyone. I also like how she describes the meeting with the parents and the teachers like, oh, it's just a friendly conversation, when I'm sure that these parents and teachers are expending time and energy that they would rather use on other things just to stop these cockeyed billionaires from messing with their kids' school.
Right. We could have had a bake sale today and made some money instead of having to ward off the invading hordes of extreme high stakes testing. Frankly, I mean, even that would have been a net positive. But
it's not a nice thing to make people do.
This is the fundamental problem with this sort of philanthropic model. Is that
That's why I don't give.
it doesn't? I
Well,
mean,
I don't give money. That's why I keep it.
it really is, and I mean, bless their hearts. I'm sure they're very nice people, but it's too much responsibility for them. Human beings aren't supposed to have that kind of money because it gives them an outsized power, right? That's why they have mad kings. Every couple of 100 years, you get a nice one that's sane, but then they end up getting assassinated probably. And that's the problem with giving, $1 billion to somebody or allowing them to make it, allowing them to, exploit society in such a way that they accumulate that kind of money.
Dead ass.
It's a real problem. There's nobody in this room who if I gave them $1 billion or gave them 5 years and they got lucky enough to make $1 billion, wouldn't be completely deluded. We would all go crazy. Let's go to the phones. Speaking of